Hi everybody, this is Dr. A. We are going to do an anatomy and physiology overview of the muscular system. Alright, the functions of the muscular system. It works with the skeletal system to move the body. Individual cells are able to contract or shorten in length, and those muscle cells take up the length usually of the muscle. So for example, here that would be the length of the muscle, and then by contracting you can bend and then extending to shorten and extending these muscles. You can create all kinds of fine movement, gross movement, everything that we do, speaking, doing stuff, teaching, taking classes, all of that through the function of the muscular system. And the muscles are the organs of the muscular system. Muscles are bundles of parallel muscle tissue fibers, and these fibers contract to produce movement, and the movement may bring bones together or push food through the digestive system or pump blood. So many movements possible inside the body. There's always something moving in our body. And then the muscles may be voluntary or involuntary. So for example, if I bend my fingers and so bring bones closer together or further apart, this is completely voluntary. I can decide to do this or not do it. And then the involuntary ones are, for example, if I just ate lunch, swallowing food, eating, chewing, swallowing food. So chewing is voluntary, but then in the swallowing, it's part voluntary, part involuntary. But then when the food hits the esophagus and it's being pushed down into the stomach, the contracting of the esophagus and with the waves of contraction that push the food down, all of that's involuntary. So there's a lot of things, thankfully, we don't have to think about and that happen in our body, and those things are involuntary. So there are different types of different types of muscle in our body, and the first type is skeletal muscle. It's the most abundant. The skeletal muscles are attached to bones, and they're likely just what you think of when you think of muscles. So they produce a voluntary skeletal movement, so we can choose to do the movement, to get up, to sit down, to walk, to run. The muscle is wrapped in fascia. So fascia is the wrapping around the muscle that keeps it into one unit. And that wrapping then tapers to form a tendon that then links up to the bone onto the periosteum of the bone. And the skeletal muscle is stimulated by a motor neuron to contract at the myoneural junction. So that's the junction between the muscle and the neuron. Smooth muscles is the second type of muscle. Smooth muscle tissue is found in the internal organs. So they line hollow organs like the stomach, the esophagus, your small intestine, large intestine. Tube-shaped organs also like the airways, the bronchioles that can constrict and dilate in the in the airways, in the lungs. Blood vessels, same thing. Blood vessels can dilate and constrict to control your blood pressure. It is called smooth because it doesn't have striations. So the way skeletal muscle is organized, the way the fibers are, they do this pattern like this that causes the skeletal muscle to appear striated, or like with zebra stripes, if you will. That's probably the best description I can give you. And smooth muscle doesn't have the striation because it is not organized in neat little overlapping fibers that are all over the place. And so it's smooth looking under the microscope, and that's why I call it smooth. And it produces involuntary movement. So this is all the movements that we do not have to think about for it to happen. And then the third type is cardiac muscle, and cardiac muscle is also called myocardium. Myo for muscle, cardiac for cardiac, and it makes up the walls of the heart. And it's it's a special muscle. It has intercalated discs. It has a way to conduct the electrical signal of the heart, and so it makes it special and only specific to the heart. It is, the contractions are involuntary, and its job is to help the heart pump blood through the heart's chambers and out to the body. So here are the three muscle types. So we have visceral or smooth, no striation, a central nucleus, contracts slowly, found in viscera, blood vessels, and is involuntary. Then we have our skeletal or striated muscle. You can see the striations lightly here. There are peripheral nuclei all over the place. We see this in the trunk, extremities, head, neck. It's voluntary. And then the cardiac muscle is also striated, so you also see the striations, but it's branched, it has a central nucleus, and it has these intercalated discs in between. It contracts rapidly, it is found in the heart, and it is involuntary. So let's talk about naming the skeletal muscles. They can be named after their location. They can be their origin and insertion, or named because of their size. So, for example, location, rectus abdominis. So it's in the abdomen and helps you keep straight. Rectus, straight. So it means straight abdominal muscle, right? And sternocleidomastoid is named for its origin at the sternum. So that's where sterno. And it's ending at the clavicle, and it's the mastoid process of the clavicle. So that's what cleidomastoid is, clavicle mastoid process. So where it starts, where it ends. So that's sternocleidomastoid. And then the one that's named for size is gluteus maximus, which means maximus, large. And the gluteus is the buttock muscle. So there you go. Some representation of how skeletal muscles are named. They can be named also for their action, for the fiber direction, and for the number of attachment points. So flexor carpi is the muscle that flexes or bends the carpi, which is the wrist, right? So carpi, carpal, related to the wrist. The fiber direction, for example, external oblique. It's an abdominal muscle with the fibers that are running at an angle, like that. And then the one for the number of attachment points, like the biceps. So it's bi for two and sep for cephalic for head. So it has two heads, so it has two attachment points. That is your bicep muscle. Another one would be your quad or quadriceps, which is in your thigh. And lastly, we're going to go over the skeletal muscle actions. So these are grouped in the opposing ones. So we have abduction and adduction. So abduction with a B is movement away from the midline of the body, and adduction with two D's is movement toward the midline of the body. The best illustration of that would be jumping jacks. If you do jumping jacks, you're doing abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. The next one is flexion and extension. So flexion is the act of bending or being bent, right? And extension is bringing a limb into a straight condition. So bicep curls would be an example of flexion and extension. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So dorsiflexion is bending, the backward bending of foot. Think digging in your heels, right? And plantar flexion is the bending of the sole of the foot by pointing the toes. So point toes, dig heels in. Point toes, dig heels in. So that's dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, but we're talking about feet, and toes. Eversion and inversion. So eversion is turning outward. Inversion would be turning inward. So turning outward, turning inward, kind of turning outward, turning inward. Pronation is a turning a palm up. And supination would be turning a palm down. And then we have elevation and depression. So elevation is to raise, like raise up your shoulders, and then depression to drop them down. Elevation to raise, depression to drop down. So those are it, and that wraps up our anatomy and physiology review for the skeletal muscles. And I will see you in the next video with the word parts.